Afternoon class. Most of the match, that's a World Cup match between Ghana. I've decided to make this clip for you since maybe I decided to come early to give a recorded version on YouTube. Yes, we'll continue with the Unit 5, Section 4. We were on 4.3, that's the causes of ethnic conflicts in Africa. That was what we got to, we dealt with that. So we'll go to 4.4 that has to do with selected ethnic conflicts in Africa. Now we'll start with conflict in the Democratic Republic Congo, or Dr. Congo. Indeed has about 200 ethnic groups. And during the colonial era, one of the unifying factor among these 200 ethnic groups, right? They all saw themselves as one people, regardless of the different ethnicity they belonged to. So together, they fought for independence. They fought for independence. Now, after gaining independence, few of the people, of course, not everybody could rule or part of the government. Of course, there was the need to have some selected few. The privileged one exactly happened. But you see, the privileged ones that had the upper hand to rule two things. Of course, something like nepotism set in, and that did not go down well with the other ethnic groups who had no representative. So what happened is that these sentiment resulted into during the early stages of even the independence, and so fighting erupted in Kasai province. In Kasai province, or Kasai province is one of the provinces in DR Congo, and the fighting was between two ethnic groups, the Balumba ethnic group and the Bena Lua ethnic group. Lua ethnic group. And indeed, this conflict became intense, and about 200 houses were burned. The 200 houses were burned just some few weeks after independence, or few months after independence. And then gradually, the minority group that entrenched themselves in the government became hated. People hated them because of this idea of nepotism. And indeed, it led to rebels. People going to the bush, armed themselves to fight against the government. And of course, Kabila forces where soldiers had Joseph Kabila had soldiers from Eastern Congo, small, uh, and they were in a minority, and they attacked the Hutu and the remnant of Mobutu's army. Because you see, what happened is that Patrice Lumumba was the first president, and he was sick. Now, when Mobutu Sese Seko took over, he also entrenched himself with his own people, and of course, that didn't also go well. The ethnic groups, some of the ethnic groups. So, Kabila forces had to attack the Hutus and the remnant of Mobutu's army. And this was simply because there were refugee Hutus in the Congo border with Rwanda. And that Hutu groups or refugees in Congo border posed a threat to the Tutsi-led government of Rwanda. The Tutsi-led government of Rwanda. And indeed, that problem. So somewhere October 1996, the Rwanda tried to they form an alliance, Kabila, and indeed it resulted in a very intense fighting. And indeed, since then, uh, since then, DR Congo has not been stable. Particularly, forces have to come in. DR Congo stable. Now, these countries or nations in Africa, Rwanda, Congo, and Burundi, as well as Rwanda, Congo, Burundi, right? DR Congo. Of course, if a Tutsi is ruling in one or two of these, of course, they will have to also get a Tutsi to rule in the other nation, or else it will be a problem. So there's something like a triangle where if it's a Hutu, 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 then there will be stability. But if it's a Hutu, Tutsi, Tutsi, there will be a problem. Or a Tutsi, Tutsi, Hutu, there will be a problem. There will be a problem. So that is the problem in DR Congo. Now, a similar issue of nepotism also emerged in Nigeria. That has to do with the Biafra War. Now, Nigeria had its independence somewhere 1960, right? 1960. And indeed, Nigeria has about 250 ethnic groups. And of course, 250 ethnic groups with languages and then customs. And by then, the whole nation, Nigeria, was divided into three. And of course, later divided into four regions, which were dominated by the majority of groups there. So, for instance, the Hausa and then the Fulani were in the north, or they are in the north, and then the Yoruba in the east, the Igbo in the east. Now, the Igbo happens to be more educated by then, better educated, oriented, and of course, they were in a bit aggressive, and they were aggressive, and they, in a way, let me say, resent or dislike the northern dominance, of course, and they think that the Nigerian system was corrupt. There's corruption there. So somewhere 15th of January, there was a military coup that toppled the first president of Nigeria, Nnamdi Azikiwe. Now, this military man who toppled Azikiwe was an Igbo general, Johnson Igoyi Irosi. When Johnson took over Nigeria, what Johnson did was that he also committed a mistake of his predecessor by surrounding himself with his own people. Nepotism comes in again here. So Irosi surrounded himself with his own people. And indeed, the other ethnic groups were not happy, were not comfortable. And of course, don't forget, earlier on I said the Igbos dislike in a way, let me use the word dislike, the northerners for their own reason, right? They look down upon the northerners for their own reason. So, indeed, when they took over the reign of affairs in Nigeria, in a way, it hit the Hausa people. And then the Hausa people and the Fulani, they were in the majority. They were more than the Igbos. So they did not understand why they are in the majority, and they have led a minority group to maltreat them in a way, maltreat them. So they also, right, who was also a military man, and with time, Yakub Gawan overthrew Johnson Hiroshi. Okay, and he became the president of what? Nigeria. And interestingly, Colonel Yakubu Gawan, when he took over as a chief of state in Nigeria, he also surrounded himself with his own people. And that is one interesting thing about Africa. That is one interesting thing about Africa. Always surrounding ourselves with our own people. I don't know, our own people. So Gawan surrounded himself with his own people. And the houses took charge of things in Nigeria. And indeed, not only that, they also decided to pay back, seeing it as a time to pay back the Igbos for the ill the Igbos did to them when the Igbos were ruling in Nigeria. And indeed, it was so disastrous because history tells us that uh, quite a number of Igbos, right, quite a number of Igbos were massacred at a point in time in Nigeria. At a point in time in Nigeria, that somewhere 20 to 30,000 Igbos were massacred, and many more were attacked and maimed and whatsoever. Just with the idea of trying to not only to pay back the Igbos what they have done against them, but to like to wipe the Igbos out. But the question is, what will you gain if we should take such a step as Africans, as brothers? But this is what happened. That's one of the negative side of nepotism. So due to these atrocities, the Igbos also sat down and said, no, if we should sit down, not defending ourselves, of course, the time will come, we'll be wiped out of Nigeria and it will be disaster. So let us also do something. So all Igbos who were either wherever they were or whatsoever also came, martial forces, and indeed they had someone in the name of Ujuku, right? Ojukwu, who also came, led them to fight for independence from Nigeria. In fact, they had wanted to separate themselves from Nigeria because of the maltreatment they were going through. And indeed, that led to the Biafra War, and it was very, very, very disastrous. It was very, very disastrous. Lives, properties, and whatsoever were destroyed. And indeed, the Biafra War is one thing that, of course, Nigerians and even Africa, entire Africa, shouldn't even pray that it will happen again. It will happen again. But with time, the authorities concerned, the international world came into, and they were able to resolve this issue. This issue. So you realize that yes, ethnic conflict in Africa, one of the major issue is this idea of nepotism. When the whole people, maybe the community or society will come together, fight for independence, fight for their right. Now, since all cannot rule, the privilege, the few will be given the privilege. And when the few are given the privilege, interestingly, these few will surround themselves with their own people. These few will amass wealth. I mean, just to take care of themselves and their family, and the masses will be suffering. And this is what happening. So nepotism, if you look at the DR Congo War and that of Nigeria, of course, the main issue there is nepotism. If if the leadership of these two nations by then have, of course, we can't have equality, of course, but at least share the national cake and, of course, the ministerial position and the ministerial positions to some, I mean, the ethnic group, right? And indeed, it can be fair equality, it cannot be fairly distributed, but at least there should become some kind of level where people should be able to, you should have different, I mean, people from different ethnic groups being part of the government, a government of unity. Yeah, that's what is important here. Now, we look at the survey of ethnic conflict in Africa, part two, and this has to do with conflict in Togo. Yes, Togo, of course, became independent somewhere in 1960 with its first president, Sylvanus Olympio. Yes, Sylvanus Olympio was the first president. Now, Olympio 1960 gained independence from France. So Togo gained independence from France in 1960. Now, 3 years later, after gaining independence, what happened is that General Inyasimbe Iyadima, of course, uh, led some veteran armies all the way from the northern Togo to overthrow Sylvanus Olympio, right? And one of the accusations, the main accusation leveled against Sylvanus Olympio was that Olympio has denied or has refused. Olympio has refused providing commissions for Cabre soldiers in the army. Now, in your book, it is said Kabia, but the ethnic group is Cabre. Cabre, Cabre. So there's the spelling mistake. Kabie is wrong. The people is they are known as the Cabre people, not Kabia. It's Cabre. And so as a result of that, Yadima led some soldiers all the way from Togo, northern Togo to the southern Togo, that's Lume, to overthrow Sylvanus Olympio. Sylvanus Olympio. And of course, one of the issues by then is that Sylvanus Olympio was also surrounded himself with his own people. That's every people. So ethnicity comes in here, or nepotism comes in here. And of course, that will be one of the things that maybe made Yadima to also come in. So when Yadima took over, of course, it was not as a right. Yadima was a military man, so he took over and entrenched himself as the president of Togo for so many years. Now, there were quite a number of attempts in his life. So, somewhere May 5th, 1992, an ambush in Northern Togo were laid before the opposition leaders, of course, and of course, the target was the son of Olympio, that's the great Chris Olympio, But unfortunately, uh, they couldn't get him. They couldn't get Gilbert Olympio, but rather one of his people was murdered. Now, it was a ding-dong affair. Yadima and his people planned evil against Olympio, and Olympio also intended to do the same. That was what was going on between these two factions. Now, with time, what happened is that, of course, when the latter part of the 1980s, particularly after the end of the Cold War, the Western world put pressure on all military regimes to hand over democratically elected presidents. So what happened was that in the 1990s, Yadima, there was a forum, of course, somewhere in 1991, a forum was held, a conference was held, where Yadima was stripped of most of his powers. And indeed, of course, they appointed one Kufigo as a prime minister, and most of the powers from Yadima that were taken from Yadima given to the prime minister Kufigo. And Kofigo was to be the prime minister for some time to see to transition. That's from military rule to democracy. Democracy. I think a year or two that he was to act as a prime minister. So now what happened is that interestingly, what happened is that in August 1992, Kofigo signed an agreement with the army restoring some of Yadima's former powers and allowing him to stand again for presidency. Now, interestingly, you see, what happened is that when this conference was taken, of course, it was a pressure from the Western world that Yadima should lead the nation or Yadima should step down. Actually, the Western world wanted him to step down so that it will lead to democracy. Right. So he didn't do anything. What he did was he allowed the conference to take place. And when the conference took place, some of his powers were taken, and then a new prime minister was installed. That's the name of Kufigo, right? And the powers of Yadma reduced. Now, Prime Minister Kufigo was in charge, and he was to see to he was to see that the nation will turn into a democratic one. Now, the military were kept quiet. They didn't say anything. They didn't do anything. Now, a year in the rule of Kufuor as a prime minister, what happened is that the military, the top military in Togo, came together and went to Kufigo. Of course, went to Kufigo, and what we know is that Kufigo agreed, and then they signed an agreement with the military officers to restore some of Yadima's powers, and also to allow Yadima to stand for election since he has retired or resigned from the army. So he has to allow him to stand for election. Of course, this was not part of the agreement, but you see, in a situation of this nature, Kofico has one option, or yes, either he agrees with what the military will say, or the otherwise. And of course, it were to be you, what will you do? So what happened is that the agreement was signed, and he, Kofico, resigned. At a point in time, he resigned. An election was held, and Yadma won the election. Yadma won the election. And so Kofigo resigned, and his all interim government was dissolved, and Yadma became the president. Now, when Yadma became the president, of course, the opposition did not take kindly to that. Even the act where the when Kofi signed an agreement with the military, of course, the opposition did not agree to it. But what else would they do since they were not in charge? So what happened is that there was violence erupted in Togo between the ethnic groups and the ruling government. And indeed, it was between the Cabre ethnic group from the south and the Ewe ethnic group, which is from the south. Yes, from the south. So north and south ethnicity. And this continued till, well, of course, they were able to bring peace. So Radma was able to stabilize the country. And at a point in time, during his last term, he died, and the son has to take over. Again, here, one thing we can realize is nepotism coming in. Nepotism coming in a situation. Now, similar ethnic groups, there are some other ethnic groups that have been discussed in Sudan, the genocide in Rwanda, and then the Burundi. Genocide in Rwanda and the Burundi. Now, you see, let's look at the genocide in Rwanda and Burundi. What happened in that somewhere in 1994 in Rwanda, the Tutsi ethnic group were slain by extremists of the Hutu ethnic group. Extremist ethnic group. Now, this genocide, of course, was a potential threat, not only to Rwanda, but to the region there. The region there. Now, the attempted extermination of the Tutsi in Rwanda by the Hutu in trying to maintain control of the government in Rwanda by the Hutu in 1994 is one example of this type of genocide. Now, what happens is that the Hutu tried to take control of the government of Rwanda by destroying the Tutsis. Now, these issues normally happens when a nation is facing crisis like overpopulation, economic backwardness, ethnic tension, and what have you. Now, politically, the Tutsi-led government appears bent on repeating its predecessor mistake by suppressing its rivals and jealously guiding its power. Now, in neighboring Burundi, a similar repression has led to the rebel movement and resulted in a long-term civil conflict that killed hundreds of thousands of people. Now, what happened is that you realize that in Burundi and Rwanda, it was what? The idea of destroying the Tutsis in these nations. Now, in Burundi, there was a repression of the Hutu rebel movement and in a long-term civil conflict that killed hundreds of thousands of people. Now, many Hutus, on the other hand, believe that they have been proclaimed guilty by association and that no one cares about their suffering under the current Tutsi-led government. Current led government. Now, you see, what happened is that when you take a place like Burundi, during the colonial era, the Tutsis were imposed on the Hutus. And the colonial masters used a system of indirect rule in that place. So the Tutsis who are in the minority were in government. And the majority, the Hutus, didn't take kindly to that. perhaps because of the issue of suppression and the issue of nepotism. And that has been the bane of most of the conflicts in Africa. So the Hutus have to go to the bush, form a rebel group, and at a point in time attack the sitting government. And of course, it was a disaster. So when you look at the genocide in Rwanda and Burundi, one of the things that what is common in all the conflicts that we have discussed is nepotism community. People surrounding themselves with their own ethnic people. And that, as I indicated earlier on, is the bane of the challenge Africa is facing. Even in our present day democracy, it's happening in Africa. When a political party comes to power, it tries as much as possible to get its people on board. On board. And this is not the best. Of course, we are human beings. We are human beings. But it's not the best practice. It's not the best act. It's not the best. It is, we can be God, but we must try as much as possible that when it comes to the issue of positions, there can be fairness, of course, but let's try to make some effort to create some level of fairness. That's our appeal. When you go to the conflict in Kenya, you see similar issues there, nepotism and whatsoever in the same issue. One ethnic group being played against another ethnic group. So, how long can this go on in Africa? Let's look at the effects of ethnic conflict in Africa. The effects or the impact can be seen in two directions. One has to do with the individual or family, as well as the nation that the individual or family is living. Then the other one also has to do with the neighboring countries bordering the conflict nation. Bordering the nation. Conflict creating security and crisis for generations. And indeed, when there's conflict, one of the effects is that it creates refugees. Sometimes we watch, I remember during the Liberian War, you watch on television people, particularly the women, carrying at their back their children and then at their head luggage, their things, running from one end to the other, coming refugees. And today, I'm sure the whole world have more than 25 million displaced people as a result of conflict. As a result of conflict. Secondly, conflict makes people to become homeless. A lot of people are now homeless as a result of conflict. Look at it in Bujumbura. There are some Liberians still in Ghana. Look at what happened in Ivory Coast. There are some in Ghana. Some Ivorians in Ghana. They can't go back home because of fear for their life. And when the time there is conflict, it becomes difficult for one to meet his basic needs. Why? Because you see, even the lands, the crops are destroyed. Not to talk about shelter, not to talk about water, not to talk about light. Sometimes all these are disconnected and destroyed. Disconnected and destroyed. So it becomes difficult for people to meet their basic needs because lands, properties, and even the land are destroyed. Because sometimes people put landmines, put landmines. And indeed, this is not the best situation. But what can we do? We find ourselves in that situation. Find ourselves in that situation. Then additionally, when there's ethnic conflict, it is mostly women and children who suffer. Yes, it's mostly men, women, and men, the children that suffer. For the men, they will have to run away. They could run away or whatsoever. So they mostly men run away, and some of them go to join the rebel groups for survival. Sometimes they join not because they want to, but they realize that if they don't join, and the rebel group advances to their community, they will lose their life. But if they join that rebel groups and the rebel groups get to their community, because they're members of the rebel group, their family is safe. So children, women and children mostly are the victims. And when it happened that way, the honors of caring for the family now turns to the woman. And what happened? Poverty strikes in. And also, when it comes to what we are aware, when it comes to conflict, in some cases, children are drafted into it. Innocent children, they adapt them, take them, become rebels by force. And what happens is that their future is destroyed. Then what about the community? When it comes to the community, what happens is that the impact is that it destroys the social fabric or fiber of this community. That peace, that unity, that love that used to bind that community together will be destroyed. I realize that friends become enemies. Friends become the enemies. Petty grudges are settled in a different way, not the normal way. And when things happen that way, sometimes you feel divisions taking place, intra-group divisions, insecurity, hostility, and what have you happening. What about the effects on national economies? What happened that way, the nation that conflict is taking place also faces consequences. Well, it is war, conflict. Of course, investors will not come to invest because no investor will come and invest in a nation where there's conflict. No, no investor will come. Aid agencies will withdraw their services. Then additionally, conflict disrupt trade and economic activities because When there's conflict, you can't operate your company because the rebels will target that and take control over it. So it just trade. And who I will say I'm going out to trade? The market woman was also afraid of his life. So he or she, the market woman will not go. Then it comes standstill. And what happens? What happens? When it gets that way, what happens? Retardation takes place in the economy. In addition, physical and social infrastructures are destroyed. Physical and social infrastructures are destroyed. Hospitals, banks, and whatsoever are destroyed. An edifice that took years to be built can be destroyed within a single an hour or minute with big machine guns and whatsoever. Now, of course, conflict also have an impact on the labor market. Because at the end of the day, young guys and whatsoever will be lost. Those who die in the course of the conflict. And that will go against the nation. So conflict has this devastating effect, not only on individual or community, but the nation as a whole. The nation as a whole. And even countries that are outside the zone of the conflict are not let alone. Because take Ghana for instance, the conflict that took place in Liberia in Ivory Coast, Ghana was affected in the sense that Ghana received some Ivorians as well as Liberians into the country. And this had a drain on our economy because the limited social infrastructure or social service that is used by Ghanaians has to be new has to be added so that the Liberians and the Ivorians could live comfortably. Because now, if you give them a place to settle, definitely you need to provide the social amenities to them. And that would be a drain in a way on the economy. Because you can't just give them a place to live without shelter, without place of convenience and whatsoever. You need to put all these things into place for them to feel comfortable. And this is a drain on the economy. And of course, diseases and social vices are imported into the country, particularly now that there's conflict and whatsoever. So maybe people coming. Of course, we can't rule out that when the Liberian War happened, those who had, some of them or those who came to Ghana, at least you cannot find one that has no AIDS or any uh, sexually transmitted disease or any disease of this kind. And when it happened that way, when there's conflict, that is not the time for a nation that is outside the control health scheme of people before I admit them. That is against human rights. The person is running from conflict zone. Save the person's life. You say no. I want to do a medical health check first to see those without any diseases or any health related problem will be given the green light to enter. But the rest, those who have any problem whatsoever, will be back. That is not done. So as a result, people come in with many health-related problems. And once they get there, some of these are transmitted to the natives. And of course, social biases increase. So for instance, people from countries that have Ebola, if they run away from a country coming to Ghana, we can't rule out this issue of they carrying the virus into a new country. And of course, when a refugee comes to settle in a new country and he or she is not feeling comfortable in terms of livelihood, there's a likelihood that someone will resort to ways to make their ends meet. If it's a lady, in order to survive, to make ends meet, she may get into prostitution. If it's a guy or man, you can't rule out this issue of stealing or armed robbery taking place. You can't rule out also the issue of drug selling. So these are some of the issues that indeed it affects nations that are not even involved in conflict. Involved in conflict. So conflict, indeed, as we have seen from the section 5 and 6, particularly all the conflicts in Africa we have examined, the underpin of it is nepotism. Of course, we cannot rule out this issue of selfishness or whatsoever, but all boils down to nepotism, where we want we alone, we and our family to be always at the top. So whether it is in, the conflict in Togo, Nigeria, Congo, Sudan, or whatsoever, this idea of nepotism cuts across. It cuts across. It cuts across. And that is one of the basic challenges Africa is facing, as I indicated earlier on. Now let me use the remaining minute to discuss this. The question is, discuss the socio-political effects of ethnic conflict in your country. Or in what ways do ethnic conflict affect any one country outside the zone of conflict? Now, if you are to answer any of these questions, assuming it comes in the end of semester, not necessarily the same pattern as it is in your book. Remember that the central idea in these questions has to do with conflict or ethnic conflict. So it is important for you to first define what ethnic conflict is. Or conflict, then zoom it by defining what ethnic conflict is. And also cite example of ethnic conflict in Africa. For instance, in Ghana, in your book cited the Mambusi conflict. It's also important as part of your introduction to capture whatever you are going to discuss in the body of your essay. And once that is done, then you have what is known as a good thesis statement. And as I indicated in class, don't go and itemize your points that you are going to discuss in the body of the essay. Most students, what we do is that when it comes to the end of semester examinations, particularly the section B, whether it is because of tension or lack of knowledge on how to answer questions or whatsoever, do not bring introduction. And when you do that, you lose marks. You lose marks. So it is prudent that you have an introduction. Every essay has three parts. Of course, as some of you are aware, Introduction is there, the body is there, and the conclusion of the essay is also there. So the introduction should have what is known as a good thesis statement, define concepts or ideas found in the question. So the question like describe the socio-political effects of ethnic conflict on your country. What you need to define is what is conflict, what is ethnic conflict, and cite an example of an ethnic conflict. Now, once that is done, then you come to discuss the socio-political effects. Not one, effects, plural effects. And these have been captured in your book. So whatever effects you are going to discuss in the body should be captured as part of your introduction. Nicely. Now, based on how you number or enumerate, how you bring them in the introduction, that's how you explain it. So if in the introduction, A comes first, and A should be the first in the explanation. And when you are doing the body, please don't itemize it one. A, then you A this no. You pass that place, that stage. Leave that one to the primary schools to do. For instance, you can start with firstly, or in the first place, A is one of the political effects of ethnic conflict on my country, Ghana. Then you explain what you mean. And when you explain, please cite an example because examiners mark and because illustrations are awarded marks. So if you go ahead and explain the point without giving an illustration where the need be, you lose mark. Definitely somebody who explains and give an illustration who get more marks than somebody who just explains without illustration. So each point you have to give, please explain, you give an illustration or example. You explain, you give example. So if it's four, mostly it is 4 points. So you or 4 or 5. Then make sure you go by the demands of the person. If it is 4, provide 4. If it is 5. Now, when it comes to the concluding part of the work, what is expected of you is to give your own personal opinion. Gone are the days people summarize. Hence, the above is the effects, the social political effects of ethnic conflict in my country. It's good, but you must go beyond that. Go beyond the summary. What is your opinion? How has this ethnic conflict affected the socio-political status of your nation? That's what you are expected to do. Not to just say the above is the socio-political effect of ethnic conflict in my country. No, no. And please, as you write, time yourself. But first, jot the points down. The points you are going to. I mean, you can use the back of your answer booklet. You can use the back of your answer booklet. For instance, the last page here, you can use that page and jot the points that you are going to write in the essay. Neatly, after that, you cancel it. It's always important for you to, if it's question 1, take your time, look at the questions, jot the points you are going to discuss. If it is 4 points, take the 4 points and provide examples for each point. Then you start your explanation. Don't go ahead and say, okay, question 1, then you think you have everything in your head so you can remember. So you not jot it down. Some are good in that. But what about you? If you are like me, you can't maybe forgetfulness comes in, it creates a problem. So to be on the safer side, people like us to just turn the back of the page here, jot your points down, itemize them. If it's 4 or 5, itemize them. And don't forget, add the definition of the concepts as part of the introduction. Define the concept, define the terms that are found in the question. And time yourself. Time yourself. And then make available, if it is 45 minutes per question, make sure you use about 40 minutes. So that the 5 minutes remaining, you go over your work, read it, edit it, and before you submit. Before you submit. Make sure you have, as part of your draft, you should write introduction, you should have body and your conclusion. Because once you don't provide an introduction, once you don't provide the conclusion of your essay, these two parts, which of course sometimes happens to students, you lose marks for that. These are some of the exam techniques that will help you pass your exams. It's not an issue of, you see, sometimes I say it is not an issue of sitting down with your books from morning to evening that you are reading. Of course, it's good, but you must know your exam techniques. Exam techniques. You must know what examiners are looking for. And once you are aware of it, you don't have a problem. When you are reading, take note of it. Key terms, key concepts. Right. I'll platform and I'll respond to that. From today to Saturday that we'll be meeting for another class, I'll respond to that. If possible, you can write it when we can meet face to face on Saturday. We can discuss about that. I encourage you to read the Unit 6, Unit 6, the last unit, and then we will have a discussion when we meet face to face. Until then, we say shalom. God bless you.